to run off for just one moment. I think he was taking care of the kids. So as soon as he pops back on, we'll get started. Just so everyone knows, the recording has started. The participants are logged in, so we cannot see the participants. We can only see each other, and that's really to sort of limit the screen share. So we're just going to give the senator a moment. I love the kids' art in the back, Andrew.
Thank you. Especially not my kids' art. I just, you buy it like, a Pier 1. Like it's an office sort of packet with the fake books on the shelves and the fake art.
Now's the time to go to. Now's the time to go to Pier 1. They're having this going out of business sale.
That's right. It's a kit. It's a starter kit.
All right. We're about to start. Let's see. We'll give the senator another minute since he was on and then popped off quickly. So, L'chaim, if anyone doesn't have their glass of wine for the night. I guess Andrew's still working, so technically he can't.
I gotta have lunch first.
Yeah, one of those days, huh?
One of those days.
I have a feeling probably every day is like that, Andrew. At least it's.
The first 2
usually
days
I'm loath to skip lunch, but it was one of those days.
the first 2 days of e-learning, I could understand a glass of wine to calm your nerves.
Right.
Do you have kids in school, Pastor?
Just dropped off my oldest at Florida A&M University. My second oldest daughter is an 8th grader at Randall Middle School. And my youngest is a 1st grader at Fishhawk Creek Elementary.
Wow.
I know it was an exciting week for you. So congratulations on that, dropping your son off. So we have the senator back. So why don't we go ahead and get started? I'm going to introduce everyone and go over the quick agenda, and we'll just jump right into it. And we're on recording. So first of all, thank you all for joining us tonight. For those of you who are listening in, we have a really amazing panel. We have with us State Senator Jaffe Brandis. We have with us Pastor Michael Price. We have with us the State Attorney Andrew Warren, and Rabbi Joel Simon will be giving us some parting thoughts. And Mike, Deeson, and I, for those of you who should know, my very well awarded co-host of The Third Opinion, Mike Deeson. So Mike and I will be moderating tonight. And this program is being presented by The Third Opinion, as well as the Tampa Rabbinical Association and the Jewish Community Relations Council. This is a continuation for those of you who are listening in. If you missed the first program, Just Mercy, that was recorded. We strongly encourage you to go back and listen to that. And this is really a continuation of that dialogue. So tonight we're going to be jumping into the issue really of juvenile justice and some of the systemic problems we've seen in our juvenile justice system here in the state of Florida, which I believe is really universal across the country. Some of the systemic problems that we see that really reflect racial systemic problems. Why this is important to the Jewish community, and Rabbi Simon will sort of wrap this up at the end. We're in the month of Elul, as Mike and I talked about on our show this last week. This is a time of teshuvah. It's a time of self-reflection. It is a month of mercy, God's mercy. And you can't have justice without mercy. And these are the foundational truths of Judaism and Jewish law. And where we see a lack of justice and a lack of mercy, it's our responsibility as Jews to speak out against it. And so this is really to educate the listener audience. And so hopefully everybody will walk away with something tonight, that some bit of information that you didn't know before. And with that, I really want to kick off with you, Pastor Price. you were really sharing deep from your heart some examples of how our juvenile justice laws in the state of Florida, in particular, where officers in circuits and state attorneys have chosen to prosecute children instead of engaging in civil citation programs. You know, the lifelong impact, for instance, for a kid who might just be trespassing, as you shared last time, in an orange grove that he had walked home through his entire school career, all of a sudden he gets arrested one day. It's, you know, you got the photo that's going to be forever on the internet, right? But you also are going to always have to report that you were arrested. So it's going to impact any college applications. It's going to prevent you from getting into the military, any future job, even 20 years later, if there's an application saying, were you ever arrested? You know, how do you respond to that? So I think if you could share with the listeners, you know, from your perspective as a religious leader, as well as a community leader, what you've seen and why we need reform, I think that would really help frame tonight.
Okay. It's funny, I was talking with a young person from my church today, and I say young, he's 40 years old, made some horrendous mistakes early in his life. 8 felonies. We're not talking about a person with misdemeanors. But the last 10 plus years of his life, he's been crime free. He understands that he had to pay a penalty and that he was not on the right side of the law. So his life will forever be impacted by those mistakes that he made. Mistakes that, in my opinion, I feel he knew better than, because I know his home life and his upbringing. However, what we're discussing tonight is misdemeanor arrests, not felonies. And when it comes to misdemeanor arrests and creating a criminal record for a person for the rest of their life for something done as possible as early as 12, 13, 14 years of age, and in some cases, even earlier than that. There are multiple things that happen that you already mentioned, having to have the record and having to state it for the rest of your life. It impacts college acceptance and applications. It impacts your opportunity to serve your country in the armed services. It impacts your opportunity to get gainful employment. It also impacts what type of employment you can apply for, because there are certain employments that will not allow you to serve in any capacity, depending on what level the misdemeanor was or what the actual crime of the misdemeanor was. Anywhere from nursing field, healthcare, to teaching profession. And I have a perfect example at the University of Central Florida, where I received a Bachelor of Science in elementary education. A young lady went to the homecoming activities just before graduation. I graduated in December of 2002, got inebriated and was arrested, first time, drunk and disorderly. And the university just would not issue her degree because they said that she would not be able to be employed as a public school teacher in the state of Florida unless that was cleared up. And we're literally talking October, and graduation was in December. There are multiple cases that I could state, but that's the impact of it. It's very serious. It's life-altering, life-changing, and something that through the criminal justice system that we can aid youthful offenders with misdemeanor charges to make sure that this is not a lifelong ban and that they can get the diversion necessary to make better choices.
I'd like to ask Senator Brandis a question. You have been at the forefront of trying to change the state law, going back all the way to 2017, and still we're not there yet in the legislature. What's it going to take to make this work?
Well, I think we have made substantial strides. I think, especially in the juvenile area, you know, we've allowed for juvenile civil citations. We've come up with a uniform arrest affidavit that should be being used across the state that has a number of categories that and frankly options that law enforcement can find to give a civil citation. We're trying to encourage additional training in the civil citation frame in the civil citation world. But it's really all about diversion. most kids don't do better once they get to juvenile detention. In fact, they tend to do a lot worse. And so the data really shows that wherever we can divert and then work with that family to figure out what's the root of the problem here, we tend to get better outcomes. And I think I think we have a lot of challenges in the justice system in general. I think one of the shining areas where Florida really has been able to make progress in the last few years is the juvenile justice system. And I think we're making meaningful progress. Do I think we're done? No. But I think we're making progress, and I think we have a vision for where we want to go. Yes, I do.
Let me follow up on that, if I may. I've talked to some legislators who are not as enlightened as I think you are in this term, and they say, let's throw them in the jail, lock the door, throw away the key. Do you have a problem in convincing other legislators, because you're looking for a base level to get it up where like 85% of the kids that are arrested on these misdemeanors go into the diversion program? When you get to Tallahassee, tell me what it's like with those guys who are just the so-called law and order guys.
Yeah, so I think the simple truth is that for the last 2 decades, there has been very little leadership in the world of criminal justice coming through the legislature. Most of that has been driven by state attorneys and sheriffs. And their solution to many of the problems was to provide more mandatory sentences, allow them to direct file. It was the harshest of the harsh kind of penalties that they could put on. But what we've seen and what the data and research suggests is, and that doesn't work, right? Most people aren't thinking about, they're not thinking about the penalty when they do something. A vast majority of the people that State Attorney Warren deals with have no clue what the penalty for their crime ultimately is. What they're scared about is getting caught, right? And so what can we do to focus our energy on putting more law enforcement on the street and putting more diversion opportunities in place, so that if they do something wrong, there's a more likely chance that they're going to get caught. And two, when they do get caught, we're diverting them and putting them in place and working with them to make sure we correct that activity. Because the last thing we want to do is to separate them from their families, to house them with other teens that have poor behavior records and will probably teach them terrible, terrible habits, and then release them back with little supervision, little training, and no support.
So, Senator, by the way, I just want to applaud your courage and thank you for your leadership in criminal justice reform, not just in this area, but we also know that you have been really leading the charge with additional criminal justice reform in this last session before really the world was turning an eye on it. So thank you for that. And this question is for you, and it's also for Andrew Warren, our state attorney. Mike and I had an opportunity to interview and speak with Sheriff Gualtieri of Pinellas a couple weeks ago. And he has been very successful. I mean, before you mandated it and passed your legislation, Senator, in 2018, he's been very successful in a civil citation program for almost 20 years now in Pinellas and Pasco counties, with close to a 98 to 99% usage rate of civil citations instead of arrests when it comes to juveniles. But we know, and he talked about this, that the problem is that there's no consistency throughout the state. Each circuit has the opportunity to determine how they're going to implement civil citation programs, which we know are extraordinarily effective, that 95% or more of the time, these children are not going to reoffend. How do we deal with that issue? I think we are all just confounded by this. How can we get to this 80% benchmark? How do we address the problem that there are so many cooks in the kitchen, whether you're dealing with different circuits and you're dealing with different sheriffs and everybody wants to implement it their own way. How can we get to a place where all of a sudden we say, no, actually 80% is the benchmark. Every circuit in the state of Florida is expected to make that. And if you can't, you have to report it to us. How do we get there?
Well, I think we do that in a couple of different ways. One, I think we give them the flexibility and the tools. I think it's very important to each individual circuit, each individual law enforcement agency, that they be given the flexibility. They want the tool and they want the flexibility to use it as they design it. I don't think anybody's system, including Gualtieri's, is perfect, right? And everything is going to need to be refined over time. And so I don't think what you're going to see is a heavy-handed state mandate of a certain percentage, because, you know, while we say 85, 90%, there may be cases where some years you're at 74% and some years they're at 92%, right? What we're looking for is a baseline average. And so I think we can do that and provide them the flexibility and the tools. And then I think it's important and incumbent upon what we've asked DJJ to do, Department of Juvenile Justice, which is to every year update the best practices and make sure that we're training to the best practices so that everybody knows what the standard is, what the best practices are. And then it's up to voters and pastors to hold people accountable at the local level, to meet with their sheriffs and say, why aren't you doing this? This is the best practice. Why haven't you not implemented it? Or why are your numbers so wildly skewed versus your neighboring county that has the exact same issues? So it's really up to the people to hold their elected officials accountable, and it's up to the state to allow sheriffs to innovate and to provide best practices and guidelines throughout the state.
But Andrew, what surprises me is you have a very open approach and buy into this, but Pinellas does so much better than Hillsborough. What's the hang up here when we look at Hillsborough compared to Pinellas, our closest county?
Well, first, let's just take a step back for a moment, Mike. I want to go back to the question you asked before to Senator Brandis about his ability to influence some of his peers in Tallahassee. And we have to, look, we have to bust some myths tonight. And we need to start with the idea that being open to giving kids second chances and being tough on crime are not, this is a false choice. This is not a choice between keeping our neighborhood safe and having diversion programs. It's not a choice between making sure that we are protecting our families and giving kids a second chance. Giving kids a second chance through diversion programs, through civil citation programs, keeps our neighborhood safe because it protects the long-term safety of our community as well as the immediate safety. These programs work to reduce recidivism. They keep kids out of the system. They keep low-level offenders out of the system. So we don't end up increasing the likelihood that people escalate in their conduct. So I just want to make sure we're all on the same page from the beginning. This is not a, well, we want to give kids a second chance because gosh darn it, they deserve it. They do deserve it. The mistake that a kid makes when he's 14, 15, 16 should not haunt him or her for the rest of their lives. But just as importantly, this is a way to actually make our neighborhoods safer. It reduces crime. It reduces recidivism. It saves money for taxpayers. It is a win-win-win. So to your specific question about why are we not doing as good a job in Hillsborough as in Pinellas, the short answer is that we haven't found the right way here to utilize civil citations when we don't have parental consent or when the kid's agreeing to it. In other counties, and Pinellas is a great one about this, even when they arrest a kid, when they take a kid into custody who is civil citation eligible, they don't effectuate the arrest. They basically go back in time and say, well, we arrested him, but we're not going to count it as an arrest. And we end up putting them into a civil citation program, which is a great way to do it. Our civil citation program here didn't really start until I got in office in the last couple of years. So we're still figuring out the best way to do it. And we've been talking with the stakeholders recently. We need to find that safety valve for when on the scene a kid says, to heck with you, I don't want a citation, and the parent isn't there, and the child needs to be taken into custody because you can't just issue the citation. How do we take the juvenile to the juvenile assessment center, but then make sure that we're not actually recording the arrest? And once everything calms down a bit, we do issue a citation. That's how we're going to get our utilization rate up.
Let me ask a quick follow-up. Is this a state attorney office decision or the sheriff's office, Chad Chronister, or you? Who makes the decision about whether it's a civil citation or whether it's an arrest?
Well, on the ground, it's a law enforcement decision. I mean, it's not assistant state attorneys who are out, in uniform dealing with the kids who are, committing the offense and then making the decision to issue the citation. But we have worked with our law enforcement partners, not just the sheriff, but police departments as well. And they all embrace the civil citations. Again, the problem we've hit has been sort of the logistical problem of what do we do when the parent is not consenting. And we can't just hand a kid a piece of paper and say, go on your way, because that's not a way to actually have an effective civil citation program. But we've been, over the past few weeks even, have been working to change what we're doing to get the utilization rates up. But keep in mind that we were just behind the curve on this. I mean, as Laureen mentioned, they've been doing this for 20 years. Or maybe, Mike, it was you who mentioned it, forgive me, but they've been doing it for a long time. And in Hillsborough, there was no real program in place until the summer of 2017, when I started working with the other stakeholders here to get one in place, to expand it, to have a program that's now serving, about 800 kids a year. Yes, we want to get the utilization rate up, but we have made huge strides in just a couple of years to get this program off the ground.
Yeah. And so, and for everyone listening, so people understand with what Andrew's saying, I mean, the state itself has an average of 62% utilization. Hillsborough County currently is at 55%, but for the most part, Hillsborough is doing better than other counties. I mean, Pinellas obviously is, they sort of stand out on their own. But I think this drives back to sort of this issue of inconsistency. And this is really for all three of you, for you, Senator Brandis, as well as Pastor Price. Pastor Price, I know you're very passionate about this issue because with the DJJ, one of the issues was that historically, when an officer chooses to arrest a juvenile versus utilizing a civil citation program, they didn't have the state why. Why are you not utilizing, a diversion program for this child? Obviously, there's been a huge push to change that, but what we see and sort of what I'm hearing, from you, Andrew, and Senator Brandis, is that there is this inconsistency. And I am concerned, for instance, in some circuits, like in North Florida, where you might have 10 counties and maybe they, people have a different perspective. Maybe they have the old tough on crime concept. How do we get to this point in the state of Florida where we really are looking at this and saying, does this old tough on crime attitude really work? Or are we, when we look at the numbers and we look at the data, or is this really a failed program that is involved in, systemic racism in many ways? It's having a direct impact on minority communities, impoverished communities. I mean, we all know that most kids, regardless of race, religion, whatever, are going to do something stupid. Maybe they're peer pressure, they're shoplifting, they stole, a shirt, or they did, whatever it is. Kids do dumb things all the time. Most of the time they don't get caught. So, how can we? I mean, I think I'm still struggling with this point. And Senator, I heard your response about not wanting to do a state mandate, but this is a real issue where there is a mindset in certain counties in the state of Florida that are stuck on this tough on crime and do not believe they need to engage in this type of diversion program. How do we get there with them beyond just pressure from the local community? What the community doesn't care? What if the community is like, no, let's be tough on crime? I mean, at the end of the day, that doesn't make it right. At the end of the day, that doesn't make it just, it doesn't make it right. So what do we do?
No, but we do give local law enforcement the authority to provide the law enforcement in their communities. We give state attorneys the flexibility to work with their sheriffs and their police chiefs in their communities to determine the system that they want. And we give local elected officials the ability to design those systems and fund them appropriately. So I think the key is, how do we establish best practices, show the data, show the results? Because I think what you find is, if you look at the outcomes in Pinellas County versus the outcomes in some of the northern counties in Florida, or some counties like Martin and other counties that are on the East Coast, what you're going to find is we have better outcomes. And so ultimately, why don't it's really up to the local elected officials and local sheriffs to say, why aren't we getting the same outcomes that Pinellas and other counties are getting? Well, it's because we're following best practices. We're establishing what the best practices are. We have policies and procedures that work. And what we recognize is diversion for most kids works better than incarceration for those kids. And how do we put more resources where they really need to be, which is helping that family unit? Because oftentimes what we find is these kids' families are a train wreck. And so how do we put our resources towards working with that family unit to help stabilize them? One of the biggest problems I've seen in the Department of Juvenile Justice is we will let kids leave the Department of Juvenile Justice. They've been in custody with us for 6 months, a year, and we don't follow up with them and making sure that they get reestablished appropriately when they go home. We release them to their parents, but their parents didn't want them. So they're back on the street. They're getting involved in crime again. And why? Because the stablest part of that child's life was while they were incarcerated with the Department of Juvenile Justice. And that is like a shocking thing for somebody like me to understand and believe, but I've seen it. And we can imagine what somebody's childhood is like when that is the stablest part of their life, right? They know they're going to get 3 meals a day. They know that there's going to go to school every day. They know there's going to be somebody there to provide healthcare if necessary, right? But when they leave the Department of Juvenile Justice, there's essentially been very little follow-up. And so that's one of the things we're pushing for now. But I think it comes back to your previous point, which is, look, we've got to provide local law enforcement the tools. But I'm somebody who believes in local control. We have to provide them the tools. We have to provide the transparency so that the public can quickly and easily see when they are using the best practices and when they're not. And then we got to allow them to be smart on crime, and have the tools necessary to implement those practices.
So let me follow up.
Pastor,
Go
ahead.
Yeah, so Pastor Price, I want to follow up with you on that because obviously you live this every day. You see the community. You've been very active and passionate about addressing these issues with the DJJ. I mean, what are your thoughts on how we get there with uniformity, how we encourage people and law enforcement to begin to participate in these programs? I mean, what do we need to do as a state and as a citizen?
I believe that Senator Brandes is on the right path as far as community involvement, but you made a very good point about some counties. There's 67 counties in the state of Florida that have a tough on law, and Attorney Warren said earlier that that's not necessarily not being tough on law by giving a child a second chance. I remember when Hillsborough Organization for Progress and Equality, which I'm a part of, began the struggle in our dark organizations throughout the state of Florida. We're seeing representatives and state senators and all these things. My wife grew up in Clearwater, Florida, in Pinellas County. And I made the point that if my oldest son, got in trouble in Hillsborough County, he would be arrested. But if he was spending the weekend with his grandmother and grandfather in Clearwater and got arrested, he would get a civil citation. And I could not fathom and really grasp that and understand that, how there could be that inequality of justice from one county to the next county in the same state. So while we may believe in locality and local decision and policymakers, that is how we allow policies to not be effective. And I honestly don't see how that can be unless there is accountability throughout all 67 counties in the state of Florida to meet a level in law enforcement with civil citations. Now, will there be some instances where a civil citation cannot be given and there's going to be an arrest? Yes. But then have the law enforcement officer to really record why that is so we can keep track of what's going on. But it makes no sense. I'm from Gaston County, Florida. My son is now in Leon County, Florida, attending college. It makes no sense whatsoever for him to be in Leon County, make the same mistake in Leon County that if he made in Hillsborough County now or Pinellas County, and now he's got a record as an environmental science major, if that college was located in Pinellas County or Hillsborough County. I don't understand that. Maybe I need a law degree to really understand it, but it just seems totally unjust because it is.
Pastor Price, what I wonder is, what Senator Brandes said that I've experienced over the years in covering this is that sometimes the kids in juvenile justice have the most stability in their lives because of the family situation. How important is it for the faith-based community, regardless of religion, to step in and offer that stability and that counseling and that help for that kid to make sure that he or she is among the 95% that never commit another crime again and never get involved? How important, and how can you coordinate all the faith-based communities and religions to make sure that there is a safety net?
Well, that's exactly what Hillsborough Organization for Progress and Equality is. It is faith-based communities, and it's all faith-based communities. I don't think we would even oppose someone if they came and say, I don't have faith, I'm atheist, but I want to see justice done here. But on a local level, as a religious leader, it is the personal responsibility of those religious leaders to be in the midst of their community, to understand what the issues are within the surrounding communities and the direct community in which you offer faith services to. I'm a full-time pastor. Outside of my job as a husband and a father, my career is being a full-time pastor. So I have to be engaged where I am. If I'm not engaged where I am with the juveniles of where I am, and I've done this from both sides. I've done this with Hope and going down and talking to the sheriff and dealing with Attorney Warren, but I also realized where I was that I needed law enforcement in certain areas. So I contacted and gathered together community leaders and went to the sheriff for District 3, where my church is located, and we worked with them to curb the crime in our neighborhood in the Progress Village area. We worked with the community to say that these officers are here for you. There was a hub for the sheriff's office there at one time. And we worked with the community. I walked door to door along with the civic council and passed out cards that belong to the deputies who patrol the area and said, you can call these persons who patrol your area and nothing's going to happen to you. But there was a fear in the community that there would be violent retribution for reporting crimes. So we had to deal with that first. And I had to put myself out on the line saying, if you call this number, no questions asked. And the sheriff department worked with us on that. So there does have to be accountability at the local level as a local leader, but those same leaders who are offering those services in their community must likewise hold the stakeholders and the policymakers and the decision makers accountable to make sure that we have a fair and just system. I don't want, because my son lives in Fishhawk and went to Newsom High School, to have a separate standard than the young people from the church and the community where I pastor who live all over the area: Brandon, Riverview, Waimama, Apollo Beach, Sun City, all those places, or Claremelle, and any of those places. I think it should be the same just system for them all.
That's helpful. I think, and it does require leadership. And, Senator Brandes, you talked about this early on, obviously, and I've seen the news reports, Politico, Flopole, each legislative session where you are really leading the charge in the state of Florida on significant criminal justice reforms, even with the Second Look Act and some of the things that you're dealing now to address prison population. And we've talked about some of the unjust and cruel sentencing guidelines. At the end of the day, Senator, first of all, again, thank you for doing that, because I know that has not been easy. I think we all greatly appreciate you having the courage to stand up and do that. Does it take more? But you're one. You're one of many voices. Does it take leadership from the governor's office, at some point to say, wait a second, we really need to enforce protocol across the state? We really need people looking at this and not giving, yes, each locality has discretion, but at the same time, there's an expectation, that these best practices are going to be enforced. I don't know how we get there. I feel like
we get there a couple different ways. So we get there. So I always tell people, to be successful in the legislative process, you need two things. You need a vision and you need a champion.
Yeah.
And so how can we individually or as a community cast our vision for what we want our juvenile justice system to be in our community? What are the expectations that we have individually for our juvenile justice system? And then how do we find or become the champion for that system, right? So how do we, for example, what can the Jewish community do to go into the juvenile justice facilities on a weekly basis and hold small groups with the individuals in juvenile justice and know when they're about to be released back to their families, and then coordinate with the faith-based community to have a smooth handoff and a sponsor so that when somebody leaves, they have somebody on the other end that they can call who cares. Because oftentimes they don't know who to call because mom will kick them back out of the house, and or somebody else doesn't want them home and they're back to couch surfing, right? But if they had a phone number they could call and reach out to, and somebody would pick up and help them get where they need to be stable, so often what they need is a nod at the end of that rope because they're just sliding down. And when they leave DJJ, everybody thinks, oh, well, they're not the state's problem anymore. But those people, they're not stable yet. They're just out of our care. So what can we do, I think, as an entire community to cast a vision for what we want and become a champion locally for what we need?
That is a great suggestion. Andrew, I have a question for you. You have basically 4 law enforcement agencies to deal with: the Hillsborough Sheriff's Office, Tampa PD, Plant City PD, and Temple Terrace PD. Is there a unification or a feeling among all of them that they're on board, or do you have some work to do with each? How does it work with you? Because I know you're a champion of this as well. How does it all shake out in Hillsborough County?
No, I think our law enforcement agencies are on the same page. We want to actually expand our civil citation program here to get it beyond just first-time offenders, which is where it's limited right now, and to get it into second and even third-time offenders, which is what the state allows. And the research shows that it still continues to keep our community safe when we give officers that discretion to use it for kids who are having not just one run-in, but potentially 2 or even 3 minor run-ins with the law. I think law enforcement sees that. But we need to get out of the mindset of thinking that this is a problem that can be solved in law enforcement or in the criminal justice system or in the state attorney's office. We're extremely proud of what we've done here to make a difference from the state attorney's office, working with our partners. But it goes back to what the pastor and what the senator were saying. This is about making sure that we have stability in kids' lives. We need to do a better job of investing in the Boys and Girls Clubs and in groups like Men of Vision and G3 Communications and Gentlemen's Quest and all these mentorship programs. I mean, we talk about diversion, but the critical question is not, do we have a diversion program? It's, what are we diverting to? What resources exist in the community to provide the structure for kids who need it in their lives? Because look, let's be candid. It's the kids who lack that structure who get caught up in the criminal justice system. It's usually not kids coming from a stable household where there's always food on the table and 2 parents there, no issues. We're seeing it come from economically depressed communities where parents are stretched thin, where kids don't have the structure in their lives, where they're not coming from a neighborhood where they have access to high quality education. We can't continue to pretend that the criminal justice system operates in a vacuum. It simply doesn't. And I agree with the senator on everything he said tonight. The problem is that money reflects priorities. And when, as a state, we don't invest money in our kids' education, and we don't invest money in providing kids with a structure and atmosphere where they can succeed, then we're going to end up spending money in the criminal justice system to deal with the problem on the back end after it causes a crime to have occurred, a victim to be created, and far more money to have been spent than having invested that on the front end.
Let me ask you, as a follow-up, is it the cop on the street that who makes the decision? A kid does something stupid, whether it's he has a joint or they're public drunkenness or shoplifting. Who makes that ultimate decision on whether they're going to issue an arrest or a criminal diversion? How does it work?
In Hillsborough County, the way it works is that the officer makes the decision. However, it's guided. We have an MOU, a Memorandum of Understanding, in place that identifies the crimes and says the presumption is that a citation shall be issued where the child is eligible unless there is a clear and immediate threat to public safety that the officer is documenting. So we don't want to take the discretion away from officers because there is no one size fits all. However, we want to encourage the officers how to utilize that discretion and hold them accountable for when they are and when they aren't. And again, the biggest issue we have is not so much with officers not using their discretion in a way that the leadership wants them to use it. It's the administrative issues of not having parental consent, not having a place to take the child, not having the resources to divert them to. Those are the problems that we need to work on in Hillsborough County.
So Andrew, just a quick follow-up on that. Because again, as Mike said, I applaud you because obviously you've worked very hard in the last 3 years in bettering Hillsborough County's record on this. Because Hillsborough County did have, as we know, historically had a very bad record on a lot of issues in the criminal justice system. And I know you've been working very hard in improving many of those numbers. But, so I guess on this MOU, first, is this something that you implemented when you came to office just to help us understand the process? And then beyond that, I'm curious, because you keep mentioning parental consent, is that like a state legislative issue? I mean, if the state legislature said, a child who's arrested, you don't need parental consent in order to release them, is that what you're looking for? Or is it more of a local issue that has to be addressed on?
So the first question is, how this got started. So we had a sort of pilot program in place in Hillsborough County that started, I believe, in, there were a couple different iterations of it, but it was not permanent. It was not expansive. It was not used a lot. It was not very effective, frankly. And so in 2017, we started working with the other stakeholders here. And in the summer of 2017, we completely redid. I mean, we created a new civil citation program for juveniles. In fact, we created one for adults here too, because the philosophy holds true. I mean, whether you're 18 and it's your first offense, or you're 15, or you're 55, we don't want that one bad mistake to ruin the rest of your life. And so the accountability works the same as well. So we've been working off that program, and it's been changed a couple times as we continue to expand it, to increase utilization, to tweak it as it needs to be tweaked. And it's been effective, and we need to get the utilization rate up. The parental consent is really a local issue here. I mean, the question is, what do you do in a situation where you don't have a parent or guardian that's consenting? And it happens a couple ways. We have some parents who say, go ahead and arrest my kid, I don't care. We have some parents who feel like their child needs to be arrested because they think that's the way they're going to get help, because they don't understand that the civil citation program actually will hold them accountable, but just do it in a way that the arrest and prosecution and conviction doesn't impact them negatively for the rest of their lives. And part of the problem is you can't just grab a kid and take him into custody if it's not an arrest. I mean, you're either arresting him or you're kidnapping him. And so when you're taking a kid into custody in the form of an arrest, what are we doing so that we're sort of putting the brakes on the arrest so that there's no arrest record? Back to the question you had asked before, you can't look it up and see the picture of the kid, and making sure that the young person can answer on a job application, college application, military application, I've never been arrested of a crime because the arrest was never effectuated and processed. That's what we're trying to figure out here in Hillsborough, looking at how other jurisdictions around the state do it.
Looking forward, Jeff, what do you see in, and this is obviously going to be a very unusual session in Tallahassee because of what we're dealing with COVID, but what do you see on the forefront? Are there any bills that are hanging in committees that can make the situation even better in the upcoming session in 2021?
Yeah, I think this is going to be one of the most challenging sessions I've had to deal with. We're hearing about budget cut numbers. It could be $3 to $4 billion. And so I think you should see us as, trying to create this hierarchy of needs of state government. And amongst, at the very bottom, at the foundational level of the hierarchy of needs is safety and security, right? Nothing else can function in government if you do not have a safe and secure government. And so I think what you're going to see us continue to dedicate necessary funds to maintain the safety and security. But I also think it's an opportunity for us to have policy discussions that frankly weren't on the table a few years ago. Because I think we can show, one, we can save money, two, we can get better outcomes, three, we can focus on public safety, right? I think one of the things that I found in the statute books that I think is by far the craziest thing is that the purpose of our criminal punishment code is to punish. It is not to provide public safety. And I think it should be to provide for the public safety. And if we can show that we're getting better outcomes, if we can show that the research and the data and other states' best practices are far superior to ours and are saving them money, why aren't we doing that? And it seems hard for conservatives or libertarians or Democrats to anybody to disagree with that. And what I find is if people come to the area of criminal justice reform for different reasons, whether it's the social justice reason, whether it's the personal liberty and freedom reason, whether it's a religious belief that we should treat inmates as we would like to be treated as inmates and put ourselves in their shoes in those situations. I think we should embrace all of those because all of those lead us to a better outcome at the end. And I think we need to have a discussion that moves away from some of the areas we've been talking about and really focuses on, are we being smart on crime? And are we doing the things that are really shown around the country to work and dedicate our resources to those?
So Senator, a quick follow-up to that. I mean, obviously, the idea that they're there to punish versus making society safe seems absurd, right? I mean, the idea is that there should be justice and there should be mercy, and that everyone should be given an opportunity, a second chance. But there obviously are violent criminals and violent crimes, and that makes sense. And that's appropriate sentences in those places. But I'm curious because you talk about the money, obviously, to keep someone in jail, whether it's a juvenile or adult, costs a lot more money, substantially, to taxpayers than effectively utilizing successful diversion programs. My sense was that the bail bondsmen and maybe the private prison owners may have been the largest opponents to some of your criminal justice reform legislation. But, help us understand sort of what that looks like really as far as saving taxpayer dollars. I mean, not only are we doing the right thing, but it's saving taxpayer dollars. Help us understand what that looks like, and also help us understand really who are those opponents that are putting pressure on you and others.
I think there's an interesting thing happening in Florida right now that we really haven't seen in a long time. I think there's a growing division in the state's attorneys. I think there's starting to be some division within the sheriffs that have just different perspectives on how to get better outcomes. Historically, they've been in lockstep and in unison, and without legislative leadership to push back on it or challenge or to recommend or produce any kind of alternative data, the legislature just kind of went down that path because the easiest thing you can do is listen to your local sheriff and just do what they say, right? They're in most communities, the best known elected official in that county is the sheriff, right? And so it's very easy to just follow their lead. But ultimately, if we sit back and we have a legislative vision that is different and that is based on best practices and research and data, then I think what you can find is you're going to begin to see splits within the state's attorneys. I think you're going to see splits within the sheriffs that where they're not all going to come in lockstep. And that begins to allow legislators the freedom to pick a camp, right? And that is what I think legislators want. They want the safety and security of knowing that there are people out there with different points of view. And when state attorneys separate themselves out from the pack and say, listen, we think that there's alternative data out there that supports this position that we may not agree with our colleagues on, but leaving the pack is leaving safety. And that is a challenge for legislators to do, states attorneys to do, and sheriffs to do. And it takes bold leadership, champions that are willing to stand up on those issues. But I think we're starting to see a growing contingent of sheriffs and state attorneys that have a different perspective.
Pastor Price, I wonder if you could address the racial divide. Most of the Jewish community that's watching this, I live in the Plant School District in South Tampa. There are people in Carrollwood. Does a kid in say where I live have a better chance than a kid that lives, say, in Claremelle, doing both the same type of criminal activity? Is the kid in the Plant School District going to get a bigger break than a kid that lives, say, in Claremelle?
I would say absolutely yes. And it is simply socioeconomics and the great divide among economics, because in low income areas, that is usually where there is the higher crime rate. And so the officers who are policing in those areas, I do not personally believe are as stressed as the officers who are policing the low crime areas. So I certainly agree with that. The child in the more successful socioeconomic area is going to get a break. But how do we make sure that changes is my concern. And what I think makes that change is me being able to be on this platform to say thank you to Senator Jeff Brandes for all the work that he has done. He listened to the DART organizations and the communities. To thank State Attorney Andrew Warren for coming in and implementing the policy necessary. But to get it done throughout our entire state, this platform has to be with the stakeholders. I think we had this change in Hillsborough County because we had stakeholders at our Nehemiah Action rallies, and they literally heard the stories of the persons who were being negatively affected by the laws. Now it's not just data driven. Data doesn't give a story. Data tells the story of what's happening collectively. But people who are decision makers need to hear from the people who are being negatively impacted by the laws. And I think for those of us who are truly human and have a heart, when we hear those stories and we can now associate someone with it, it drives us to now make a difference. And Senator Brandes is right. Someone has to be willing to step outside of that box and say, I'm going to lead this charge. But often that can have a high cost associated with it, in particular for elected officials. I don't have that issue, but it can have a high cost associated with it for elected officials. And you just have to have the confidence that you're doing the right thing. And in doing the right thing, you will be secure in what you're doing and securing in whatever your maker is leading you to do. But we have to have this platform. I'm going to say it again, where I give hats off to State Attorney Warren and Senator Brandes. We've been talking with we were talking with Sheriff G. We're talking with Sheriff Cronister. We've talked with Chief Dugan. We've been to the table. But when you come to those rallies and to those Nehemiah actions, you're sitting among 1,200 to 1,500 people from all different walks of faith. Doesn't matter if you're Republican, Democrat, Independent, Jewish, Muslim, Protestant, Christian. Catholicism. We have a need to make our community better. And we need, as a nation, not just our county and our state, we need to come away from all of the divisiveness that we have allowed to be rooted in our politics. And because we're so divided, it's also rooted in our faith walks, in the place where we should have some level of commonality. Because for the majority of all faiths have a statement about mercy and justice and doing right. So as a person of any faith, I want to make sure that all of humanity is treated equally, regardless of their race, regardless of their zip code, regardless of their economic status, regardless of their educational background, whether it's a single parent home or a two-parent home, or the mother's working 2 jobs, or whatever the reason is, we need to just find a way to make it happen. I know the chief police in Clearwater, who was not on the same level as the county in Pinellas, researched and discovered the issue of the parents not being willing to sign off. And he took it upon himself to call each parent individually and explain to them what they were putting their child up against by not signing for the civil citation. It takes a person in the position of power to have that kind of tenacity and care for justice and mercy when the facts are given to you to then orchestrate a change.
Andrew, what can you do also to eliminate the racial divide between a kid in the Plant District in South Tampa and say Clermont as an example?
There are a couple things. The first is we need to make sure that we're identifying what's causing the problem. I mean, we know that some of those disparities exist because of things outside the criminal justice system, right? I mean, they stem from the structure or lack thereof that we talked about before. We know that there's a correlation between economics and education and criminal justice. So just identifying those roots is part of the problem-solving process. Another thing is, of course, making sure that law enforcement is exercising their discretion in a way that's not creating disparate outcomes. And we know that that happens too. And so we have to take a hard look at what officers are doing and why officers sometimes treat people differentently based on the neighborhood they live in, their zip code, their economic status. Some of it is based on the statutes, and Senator Brandes referred to the criminal punishment code before. We know that the way we score things in our system tends to not be forgiving, not have mercy, but instead treats people as if a mathematical equation can arrive at the right outcome for holding somebody accountable and ensuring public safety. And of course, we have to look at what we're doing in prosecutors' offices. And this is something that we have taken on ourselves, recognizing that we can't identify all the blind spots we have. So we have partnered with outside agencies. We have researchers from USF, their criminology department, who look at the decisions we make about charging kids to help us identify if we're contributing to racial disparities, and if so, how to correct them. So there are a lot of different pieces that lead to the disparate outcomes that we all know exist, that hopefully all of us reject in a system where we're all supposed to be treated equally under the law. But it's not as if there's a single solution to this. There are multiple causes for the problems, and therefore there are multiple solutions to address each of those contributing factors.
So thank you for that. And I just want to go back to Pastor Price's comment. Pastor Price, you said something about, when you mentioned Chief Holloway, who I believe is the chief of police in St. Pete, and he participated in the last program, picking up the phone and calling parents. One of the reasons why we're having the program tonight, obviously, is there's just a lack of education in the community. And you can understand parents not understanding that, listen, I can't control my kid. I want to have, there's issues here. I need you to help. And so Arrest My Child versus Civil Diversion Program, there is a lack of information out there. So obviously education is necessary. But I just want to share a quick story of why we're having this dialogue, to go also to what you said, Andrew, and what Senator Brandes said earlier. And then we're going to wrap it up with Rabbi Simon. for his final parting thoughts, because we're sensitive of everyone's time tonight. But Reverend Willie McClendon, he's a pastor of Shiloh Missionary Baptist Church, which is a member of HOPE, the Hillsborough Organization of Progress and Equality, and the statewide larger DART organization, was sharing a story this summer about a young man who, when he was 12 years old, an autistic child ended up hugging someone at school who did not want to be hugged. And the resource officer at that school arrested this child for hugging someone, an autistic child. That child is now 29 years old and to this day has issues with gainful employment because of that arrest that happened when he was 12. That's why we're having this dialogue today. It's why it is so important, the ideas of justice and mercy to the foundation of Judaism, but just to the foundation of humanity. So I personally want to thank each and every one of you for giving us an hour of your time tonight. We so appreciate this. It was just unbelievably informative and helpful. And I want to turn over to Rabbi Simon for his parting words.
Well, first of all, thank you to Laureen and to Mike, our hosts, and really challenging our community every week to think about things in a different way or three different ways. And to Andrew and State Attorney Warren and Senator Brandes and Pastor Price, thank you so much for taking this time tonight. As you guys all were speaking, and one of the things that I found myself thinking about is the Jewish concept of bar and bat mitzvah. And even, I'm not going to worry about the age, whether it's 13 or actually biblically the age of majority is 20. But the idea is that until you reach that age of adulthood, there are two pieces. One, your parents are responsible for your actions until you hit adulthood and you become responsible. But the other has to do with obligation, that with ritual law, at least, things like keeping kosher and Shabbat, so very different from what we're talking about. But until you reach that age of adulthood, you're not even obligated to follow the law. Not until you hit adulthood are you obligated. But at the same time, that doesn't mean that minors are running around doing whatever they want. They're still taught to follow the law. And the obligation on adults is educating those kids so that once they do reach the age of adulthood, they know the right way to act. So, you know, I really commend everyone who was talking about, it's not just about the arrest, it's about what happens leading up to them and how can we help in that education. But the other piece, and something that I teach to all of our kids, is that idea of responsibility and obligation isn't something that just happens. And there are a lot of people who may be old, who I wouldn't say are an adult, and don't understand the consequences of their actions on others. So as we're in this month of Elul, the month which is leading up to Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, our high holy days, and we're supposed to be going through that period of introspection for ourselves, I think those of us, us old people, have to be thinking about the consequences of our actions on the next generation. And our prayer is that all of those who are in positions of power and positions of decision making, but also all of us who have a lot of power in decision making, recognize the huge, huge obligation that we have to the next generation in that education and in making sure that young people are in a position to succeed and in a position to understand what responsibilities they each have. So thank you to all of you. May your work lead to change. May we all be able to be partners with you in that work. And, you know, last time when we spoke, people said, we keep talking, when are things going to happen? And I'm truly optimistic that things are going to start happening. So thank you. Thank you to all of you.
Thank you, everyone.
Good night.
Thank you all and good night.
And we will
night.
provide information for those who are listening for the recording, as we'll make it available publicly for people to pay attention to watch who couldn't attend tonight.
Great.
Thank
Yep.
you.
I'll put it up on our YouTube page and send that to you guys as well.
Thank you again, everyone.
Thanks.
Yeah.